As I've discussed quite a number of times on this channel, there are certain movies which are maybe a lot better than you're expecting them to be, but unfortunately many people don't even hear about them, or you might see it in like a bargain bin or as a suggested movie on Amazon or eBay, but it just looks so cheap. It has maybe an uninspired title or marketing. Maybe they just didn't have the budget for marketing. Maybe the cover art is underwhelming. And of course there are plenty of movies, especially it would seem in the horror genre, that unfortunately fall victim to that. There are some truly great movies which were straight to DVD, or just didn't have the marketing budget and didn't get the word of mouth that they needed. But I would say that on this occasion, it's worth trying, because this is a movie that I went into expecting it to be a pretty cheap, forgettable, ho-hum kind of horror movie that 9 times out of 10 I probably wouldn't even finish. There are plenty of horror films like that where I start them and end up either not finishing it, skipping lots of it, or just watching the whole thing on 1.5 times speed. That didn't happen here, because I really like this movie. Now, I'm not going to say that this is some kind of masterpiece. However, I will say it's a lot better than I was expecting it to be, and a lot better than most people would probably expect it to be. Now, I haven't checked out what kind of scores this movie has online, but I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't many scores, and if there are, that they're probably not too high, because there are certain movies that just don't get respect, and it's almost cool to dislike them, especially if a movie doesn't have an established name, so it's easy to take shots at it. I think this is probably the case with Wrong House. It's an unfortunate name. I'm not sure what I would have called it, because the name is accurate, but it's just unfortunately a little dull, and the essential plot revolves around a very interesting concept which doubtless has been done before in variation, but this is one of the only times I can think of where it's been done in this way. So there are 2 different families who are both looking to live in a new place for at least a while, if I recall correctly. I think one family might be looking to move house and the other ones are looking for a holiday home or something like that. But essentially they both end up at the same place that's for sale. So they're both viewing the house at the same time, and then suddenly out of the woods, out of nowhere, a girl comes running out, clearly in distress, very Texas Chainsaw style, of course, one of the first movies to ever do that, if not the first to make it famous. And she's got her tongue cut out. She can't speak, she's clearly distressed, and what the hell is going on? They don't really know, so they try to go back to the house, then they try to leave. And that's where things get interesting, and that is where my mind started to be changed to opening up to the potential that this movie actually could be pretty good. And that is when they try to leave, they drive back down the lane, away from the house, through this dense forest where the home is located, and then they're back at the house again. Then they drive down the driveway again, and they're back at the house again, on this seemingly kind of horror version of Groundhog Day-esque loop, where they keep on driving in any direction but end up back at the same house again. I think that's a great concept. As I said, doubtless it's been done before, there are plenty of variations on that idea, but what I like as well is that it's done, as I said, in a Groundhog Day kind of way, but it's done instead of with time, which is what Live Die Repeat does, what Groundhog Day does, what Happy Death Day does, a number of others, but instead of using that gimmick, if you will, in order to change time, having the same day repeat, this movie uses it on location. So instead of the day repeating, you just cannot get away from the place. And I think that's an interesting idea, and it's one which has kind of been used in Krampus as well, but in a different way. But you could probably see the similarities there if you've watched Krampus, and you'll know what I mean about that. But as far as how the rest of the story pans out, basically the house seems to want to drive the families crazy, pitting them against each other, having this kind of gnawing, nagging away at every person there, get into their individual fears and doubts and guilts. And as I said, I thoroughly enjoyed how it panned out. Now, I'm not going to say it's a perfect movie. Of course not. My scores are going to mirror that as well. Some of the performances are a little shaky sometimes, to say the least, but even then I would say that the majority of the characters are way better than most horror films. Now, of course, that's not a particularly high bar, so if you're coming not from the horror genre into it and watching it, you probably won't think it's that great. But for those of us who love horror, we really do know the standard of good acting when it comes to horror. And it's a completely different standard, if we're honest, to the rest of cinema. The rest of cinema has just genuinely good acting across the board, but with horror, we value those really good performances, or even just decent performances, because they're so rare. There's so much trash that any rough diamond stands out. And I would say that this is one of those occasions. Is it an Oscar-worthy movie in any way? No, of course not. But it's a lot of fun, it's an interesting idea, I think it's very well carried out. And one of the only things that I might have personally liked to have been done a little differently was maybe the colour or the saturation. It's a little bright and white, kind of washed out looking, in a similar way to something like 7 Days of Retaliation, but where it fit the tone for that film because it's very sombre and very sad. In this one, I don't know, it just didn't fully fit for me. I would have preferred maybe a little bit more colour, but even then, it certainly doesn't break the film for me. Now, as far as my individual scores, I'm first of all going to give the story and the plot a 7, which is a very, very good score, because I think it did a lot with what it had to work with. It was a great idea, and I think it was very well carried out. There were no huge story-destroying plot holes for me, which again often happens in horror, and I don't recall many small, nagging plot holes either. There might have been one or two, but nothing that really disrupted the flow for me in particular, or at least not that I can recall at the moment. As far as the characters, the casting, the performances, the motivations, I'm actually going to give it, perhaps surprisingly, another 7. Now, I think of all of the scores, that might be the one that some people will disagree with, and I can understand why. As I said, none of them are Oscar-worthy, but I think that the performances are believable for the most part. Some are definitely better than others. The characters, although sometimes cliched, actually do feel pretty good, and some of the character interplay when tensions are rising, especially when they spend a certain amount of time at this house together and it becomes more and more strained on all of the relationships, and it becomes that the house isn't the only threat, as you'd expect with stuff like cabin fever even setting in. So for me, it's an easy 7 as far as the characters go. As far as the visuals, I'm going to drop a little bit to a 6, because, as I said, it's a little bit too washed out in terms of colour, a little bit too bright, I think. But overall, the visuals, they do a good job. It's designed to look bleak, which of course lends itself to the colour, but the house itself looks bleak. It's relatively unused, lots of covers over everything, it's been empty for quite a while, and again, it suits the style. It's just not anything necessarily that's going to blow your mind, and I think that for me, the biggest reason why I'm knocking the score a little bit to do with the colour and how bright it was is because it makes it look a little bit cheap. I'm not saying that it had a great budget anyway, but there are certain things that you can do, of course, to make your movie look better quality and more expensive than it actually was. Look at Black Mountainside, for example, my second favourite horror movie of all time. That does an excellent job with what it has to work with long, continuous shots and great vistas. This movie could have done more, that's for sure, so that's why my score is just a little bit lower there. As far as the audio, the soundtrack, etc., sound design, I'm going to give it a 6. Again, it's above par, but not anything that's necessarily going to blow your mind. It's not really a jump scare audio kind of horror movie either. It's more like a slow burn with a lot of tension rather than just a slasher killing everyone. It's not that kind of movie. And finally, for the fun factor, the rewatchability, the entertainment on your own in a group, well, for that I'm actually going to keep the streak of 7s alive with another one. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10, because for me, I would definitely check this one out again. I definitely recommend it as a severely, or at least from what I've seen, a severely undervalued movie. And I think it's one of those occasions where some people could go into this movie and think, why did he speak so highly about it? I think it was just okay at best. And I could kind of understand that, but for whatever reason, I connected with this movie, I really enjoyed it, and I think part of it is probably because it was better than I was expecting, because being pleasantly surprised is always a great thing, especially in horror, because, as I said, there is so much trash, so finding good stuff is relatively rare. So for me, as a tabulation of all 5 of those categories put together, I'm actually giving The Wrong House a pretty decent score of 3.3 out of 5, which of course works out to a 6.6 out of 10, or the equivalent on Rotten Tomatoes of something like a 66%, or thereabouts, because of course that's an aggregate site anyway. So not an amazing score, but it's a movie that I would definitely recommend checking out. Some of the performances, some of the moments, and the washed out colour are basically the only primary drawbacks for me, and if those two things in particular were fixed, I may give it, say, a 3.5, maybe even a 3.6 instead of a 3.3. So just a couple of drawbacks. Overall, definitely worth a watch. I don't recall it being overly long either, and I found it interesting. I didn't find it boring at all. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I can definitely recommend it if you haven't seen it already. And chances are, most people probably haven't already seen it. So that's it overall for this pick. Of course, I will see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.